This was by far one of the weirdest episodes I've ever seen in Dragon Ball history, and boy do I have a lot to say. So let's get started. Now, episode 43 of Dragon Ball Super starts off with kind of another realistic attempt for Dragon Ball, where we see Goku obviously is struggling to basically control his ki, and King Kai is telling him that this is basically a side effect of having all of those fights in the Universe 6 tournament. And the interesting thing about this is that Goku's actually becoming somewhat of a threat to others and himself, because he's falling around. He's literally like a drunk man in a Saiyan body. And interestingly enough, Kai tells Goku that he has to take a break from everything that's going on. Goku pretty much has to comply with it, because he basically says that if Goku does not comply with it, he's not going to get any stronger. So obviously Goku has to comply to some degree. Now, the interesting thing about this is that in the process of Goku trying to basically relax, he has to stay at Gohan's house because he destroyed his own house, and we find out some other interesting details that I'll point out later. But pretty much in a nutshell, Goku goes to hang out with Gohan. Pan is being babysitted by both Goku and Piccolo, and interestingly enough, with Goku basically, losing Pan for a few seconds, she leaves, and pretty much the Pilaf Gang come. They indirectly kidnap Pan, and that's pretty much what the story goes from here, where we see some interesting things about Pan later. So let's go into the nitty-gritty of things. There were no real action sequences in this episode, but there were a lot of interesting details that I pointed out. The first thing is that when Goku was suffering from this Kai syndrome effect, he actually met a Rayleigh, who's pretty much, for those of you who don't know, a character from the Dr. Slump series, and she actually was in the Dragon Ball series during the Red Ribbon Army arc, where Goku was taking on General Blue. So then we move on later on to making another point about the fact that Goku actually showed up in Bulma's house, and Bulma was partially naked at this point too. And I think that this is kind of interesting, because they're kind of taking a nod at another earlier episode of Dragon Ball Super, where we see Goku going off to go train with Whis. And I think it's kind of funny, because it's like Goku always bumps into Bulma when she's like at, I guess you could say, either a nude position or a position where she's not really in the mood to really interact with people. And this is something that hasn't just been going on with Dragon Ball Super. This has been going on ever since Dragon Ball, with Master Roshi and Bulma, with Goku and Bulma. Bulma is always put in these awkward situations with men just observing her body in an obvious condition that she would not want them to see. And another thing I also noticed, and it's very interesting that Herms pointed this out on Twitter, he mentions that Chi-Chi lied about spending all of the Zeni. And I think that this is really funny, because this is pretty much a play on Goku's intelligence. And I think this is a play on his intelligence because Goku doesn't really have a literal concept of like a lot of money. Goku doesn't understand that having millions upon millions of Zeni is what is different from having thousands and thousands of Zeni, because if you look at Goku as a character, he just knows rich, he knows poor, and he pretty much is a country kid. So if you look at it from that perspective, it's easy for Chi-Chi to lie about that Zeni thing, because she can play that on her husband, knowing that if she just says they lost all the money, it can motivate Goku to work. And I think that's a very, very, very interesting thing that they actually pointed out. And I think all of us as fans would pretty much already know that it is virtually impossible to spend all of that money for a baby being born. So I found that was interesting. And probably what you guys are probably the most curious about me talking about is the whole thing with Piccolo being a babysitter, how he's basically saying how he's read up on a lot of books about how to babysit babies in general. And I find it interesting because Piccolo, with, I don't want to say raising Gohan, but Piccolo did, I guess you could say, train Gohan for, the earlier stages of his life. And then, when Goku had to go back to the afterlife, he kind of had to oversee Goten and Trunks during their fusion. So it's kind of interesting that Piccolo has always taken on this paternalistic role in the Dragon Ball series indirectly. It's not like he chooses to do these things. It's just like these parenting roles are always thrown on Piccolo. And I thought that was very funny how Piccolo's giving advice to, Goku on how to take care of Pan, because the interesting thing about it is that a lot of Dragon Ball fans are always talking about how Piccolo is a better father than Goku. So it's kind of like taking a funny indirect nod at that. And I thought that was really interesting too. So pretty much in a nutshell, what I think was the highlight of this episode and my most memorable moment would probably have to be when, you know, obviously Pan is kidnapped by the Pilaf Gang. They go into outer space, and pretty much it looks like all is lost. They're gonna die. Goku's looking up into the sky thinking about Pan. Pan is kind of thinking about Goku, or it's implied at least. And then the ship pretty much explodes, and we see that Pan is somehow in the middle of space holding the Pilaf Gang. They're holding onto this baby's leg, and she's like flying around like, you know, with no regard. And the funniest thing about this is, it's like this is completely nullifying that whole thing about Saiyans being able to breathe in space, because this whole Saiyans breathing in space is another concept for another day. But I just found it interesting how Pan was just able to just tap into her powers, similar to what we saw with Gohan in Dragon Ball Z. Very similar in the sense of watching that filler episode called Memories of Gohan, where Gohan was going to crash into a tree, and pretty much Gohan powers up, breaks a hole in the tree, and then there's this big, like, you know, opening in the tree. And I felt that was taking kind of a nod towards Gohan and all the hidden power stuff that they showed with him in the Dragon Ball series. And I thought it was fun. I thought it was kind of weird, but you know what? It was okay. I thought it was interesting, and it added something towards Pan and how they might use her character some way or some another in the Dragon Ball Super series. So it was interesting to say the least. And I also like seeing the Pilaf Gang too, because they're always funny to see, such as we saw Shu, obviously, you know, with his oversensitive dog senses, he was smelling, you know, Pan's poop. And I thought that, like, that's the comical side of Dragon Ball that I think Toriyama often writes. So overall, I thought it was a decent episode. It had a big turn of events with them demonstrating Pan's power at a young age like Gohan. I think it was a fun episode. I thought the animation was decent. The artwork wasn't the best, but it's nothing to really complain about. So with this said, I'm pretty much going to give this episode 3 stars. It was a decent episode. It was fun to watch. It's not the most memorable episode in the world, but it was okay. So to move on to my predictions for episode 44, I noticed some interesting things. It's going to be called The Secret of the Unleashed Superhuman Water. I think that's already a fun title. It looks like it's going to be an action-oriented episode. We see Goten and Trunks in a lot of action sequences. Monaka's going to be involved once again. And I definitely like seeing that Goten and Trunks are going to be involved, because they are kind of the perfect characters to get into these little adventures, because as kids, they are always going to try to do something curious, but they're kids with a lot of power. So with Pan, because she's not really at a complete sapient level yet, there are certain things you just can't do with the baby, but with Goten and Trunks you can do a little bit more, and I think that's interesting. So for my prediction, I believe that this will be a one-time self-resolved story with no major casualties. It's going to be a little fun thing. Nobody's really going to get hurt. It's just going to be a battle to figure out about the super water stuff, and I think that's going to be it. So guys, I hope you guys enjoyed my review and my predictions for episode 43 of Dragon Ball Super. And I hope you guys enjoyed this video. So most importantly, over everything else, please remember to rate, comment, and subscribe. And remember, as I always say, to have a great day, guys.